Ayubowan, a warm welcome to our audience joining us from all around the globe. I'm Medini Ratnayaka. We are streaming live from Los Angeles, California, USA. Today, the America Sri Lanka Photographic Arts Society, ASPS, wishes to commemorate the World Wildlife Day 2021, which falls on March 3rd. We invite you to join hands with us to save the wildlife and our future. It is our responsibility to save lives of animals, since we are the ones who made them homeless. This is the 16th virtual Zoom panel discussion hosted by America Sri Lanka Photographic Arts Society in Los Angeles, California, USA, a member of the Photographic Society of America, PSA, and the International Federation of Photography of Art in France, FIAP. These webinars are designed to showcase the beauty of nature in the context of photography and tourism, with a special focus on the splendor of Sri Lanka's fauna and flora. Today, we focus on the imperative of preserving wildlife and our environment. Today, we have an esteemed panel, and I look forward to an exciting webinar. Our panelists are Dr. Peter H. Sand, Ms. Marie Margil, and Mr. Rukshan Jayewardene. Let me now introduce Dr. Sand, who will be our first speaker, and we are very privileged to have such a distinguished speaker this morning. Dr. Peter H. Sand was the Secretary General of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES. Previously, he was the Assistant Director General and later Acting Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. Previously, Dr. Sand has held several senior positions in international organizations, including the post of Senior Environmental Affairs Officer, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in Geneva, Legal Advisor for Environmental Affairs, World Bank in Washington, D.C., Senior Legal Officer, United Nations FAO in Rome, and currently he's a visiting professor, University of Paris, University of Munich, and adjunct professor, Durham, North Carolina, USA. Previously, he has been an associate professor, Margil University, Montreal, Canada. He has published 145 research papers in international journals on the environment, wildlife, and conservation of fauna and flora. I now cordially invite Dr. Sand to conduct his presentation. We warmly welcome you.
Wilson estimated that 30,000 species per year, or 3 species per hour, are being driven to extinction, and predicted that half of the species described by scientists today will be gone by the end of this century unless we take drastic action. Bearing out Wilson's estimates, the Living Planet report of the World Wildlife Fund noted in 2020 that the average population size of the world's wild vertebrates, mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles, has declined by over 68% over the last 50 years alone. And the new synthesis report, Making Peace with Nature, launched by the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, last month in Nairobi, warns that more than 1 million of the estimated 8 million plant and animal species are increasingly at risk of extinction. In light of these figures, the title of our webinar today, Commemorating World Wildlife, almost reads like an obituary. We can only hope that the beautiful wildlife pictures of my distinguished co-panelist, Rukshan Jayewardene, will not just become a historical memory of Sri Lanka's past, but that the continuing efforts of creative academic scholars like our co-panelist Margil may help to ensure that wildlife also remains an essential part of our world's future. Actually, there is some hope on the horizon. Edward Wilson's bold and radical suggestion for a global solution to extinction, put forward in his pioneering book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life in 2016, was to set aside no less than half of the Earth's habitats on land and on sea, and thereby preserve about 84% of all living species. That, of course, was a tall order, considering that at present, only some 15% of the world's land and less than 7% of the oceans are legally protected. The good news is that of the One Planet Summit for Biodiversity held in Paris in January this year, co-chaired by France, Costa Rica, and the UK, 52 countries committed to the legal protection of at least 30% of the planet's lands and oceans by the year 2030. As part of a new high ambition coalition for nature and people to be specified and further negotiated at the forthcoming 15th Conference of the Biodiversity Convention in Kunming, China, later this year. So, while Wilson's half-Earth goal may remain a scientist's mirage, that does not acquit us from the duty to make the fullest possible use of available instruments against the threat of extinction. It is true that the progressive disappearance of natural habitats is among the primary reasons for the dramatic decline of the world's wildlife resources. But even the spaces already nationally and internationally designated as nature reserves are far from adequately protected and supported today. Take the World Heritage Convention, established under UNESCO auspices in 1972, which currently covers and financially assists a total of over 200 natural heritage sites in 90 countries. Regrettably, the United States, which initially was one of the founders and the prime sponsor of the convention's World Heritage Fund, stopped in 2011 for political reasons to make any further voluntary contributions, hence severely curtailed the fund's projects in developing countries over the past 10 years. Let me now turn to the second major threat to the long-term survival of wildlife resources, which is their continuing economic overexploitation. Even though there is a sizable number of global, regional, and bilateral agreements placing limits or downright prohibitions on harvesting and trade of live animals and their products, numerous recent surveys illustrate their gaps and inadequate implementation in practice. To be sure, a coalition of NGOs and other international organizations, together with the United Nations agencies, now coordinates efforts to combat illegal wildlife trade and poaching. For example, in 2016, the Conference of Parties to the 1973 Endangered Species Convention, CITES, unanimously recommended a total ban on all commercial trade in ivory or ivory products. However, while most countries now comply, including China in particular since 2018, Japan still refuses to close its lucrative domestic ivory market, claiming that it does not contribute to elephant poaching in Africa. On the other hand, as regards aquatic wildlife, Japan did discontinue its so-called scientific whaling in the Antarctic, after the International Court of Justice declared the practice illegal in 2014. And the country has, since 2019, limited the taking of whales to its own territorial sea and exclusive economic zone. Ultimately, of course, human use and misuse of the world's wildlife also turns on an ethical issue. If our present generation fails to protect the Earth's remaining living natural heritage against the risk of extinction, we will deprive future human generations of the long-term benefits and enjoyment of the resources to which they too are entitled. The issue may indeed be couched in terms of the Sustainable Development Meme defined by the Brundtland Report in 1987. Development is sustainable only if it, I quote, meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, end of quote. In other words, our ethical accountability for the survival of the Earth's wildlife really is intergenerational. It might actually be defined as a kind of global environmental trusteeship, a concept which in essence goes back to 19th century political philosophy. Let me quote it here and tell me whether you can identify the author. I quote, "Even society as a whole, a nation, or all existing societies put together are not owners of the earth. They are merely its occupants, its users. And like good caretakers, they must hand it down improved to subsequent generations." End of quote. Can you guess who first formulated this maxim way back in 1865? You will perhaps be surprised. It was Karl Marx in Das Kapital, Engels edition 1894, volume 3, chapter 6. So on that note of history, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sand. And now we move to our next panelist, Ms. Margil. Ms. Margil serves as the Executive Director of the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights and Program Manager for CEDAR's International Center for the Rights of Nature. Ms. Margil previously served as the Associate Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Ms. Margil is widely viewed as one of the leading global voices for the recognition of legally enforceable rights of ecosystems and nature. In her role with CEDAR, Ms. Margil works with national, state, and local governments, tribal nations, and indigenous communities in Australia, Sweden, the Philippines, Nepal, and elsewhere to advance legal and policy frameworks regarding rights of nature. She has served as the primary drafter of a Himalayas Bill of Rights in Nepal and other groundbreaking legislations. Her writing has been featured in The Guardian, Yes Magazine, Earth Island Journal, Democracy Journal, World Policy Journal, In These Times, and Common Dreams. Ms. Margil received her master's degree from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and is a co-author of The Bottom Line of Public Health, Oxford University Press 2010, and Exploring Wild Law, The Philosophy of Earth Jurisprudence, Wakefield Press 2011. Marie, we are very honored to have you here with us today. So the forum is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today in celebrating World Wildlife Day and our distinguished panelists. I think Dr. Sand ended on a very nice note for me to pick up from, which is how we treat nature, and in particular for our conversation today, wildlife or species. How do we treat them, which means both how do we think about them, how do we feel about them, but also how is that reflected in our laws? And the consequences of human action toward the natural world, species in particular, Dr. Sand spoke of so clearly. And unfortunately, we face this out of control extinction rate today as a result of human activity. And the question becomes, why are we in this situation that we find ourselves in? Not only, of course, do we have this accelerating level of extinction such that, many are talking about this as the 6th great extinction. This time, of course, as a result of human activity, human hand. But we also, of course, face the collapse of ecosystems, such as coral reefs, as well as climate change, which is hitting wildlife species in a really quite critical way. All of these shifts occurring as a result of human activity acting upon the natural world. We treat the natural world today, and I mean we, humanity in general, treat the natural world today as existing for human use. And our laws reflect this. Nature around the world is treated as property or is treated as commerce, something that we regulate the use of to serve human wants and needs. And so, for instance, within the environmental sphere, we have laws such as oil and gas laws and mining laws and fishing laws and forestry laws. And those laws all are legalize and authorize human use of the air, of species, of plants, of the sea. And so, for instance, in many countries around the world, we see fracking for oil and gas. And the law legalizes that activity, even though we know it brings great, significant known harm. We legalize the blowing off the tops of mountains in my country, the United States, literally dynamiting the top of a mountain to mine coal, with all of the harm and devastation that causes, not only for the mountain, but the species that depend upon it, and the lakes and streams and rivers that depend upon it. In the United States, we have this massive river system, the Colorado River, in which every drop of water of that river has been allocated for human use before it will ever reach the sea. We have laws which legalize how much fish we can take out of the water, how much of every single creature. We wonder, why are there environmental crises happening? It's because we treat the natural world, as Colombia's Constitutional Court said in 2016, in a case in which it first recognized that a river ecosystem within the country of Colombia possessed legal rights to be protected. The court said that we humanity, can no longer think of ourselves as a quote unquote ruler of nature, that it's time for us to recognize that we are part of nature and dependent on nature. Yet our laws continue to treat nature as existing to serve us, and legalizing our authority to harm nature to serve our wants and needs. And so we continue to treat human beings as superior to nature being a subordinate. And of course, we've seen this throughout history, that human beings have, for eons, millennia, treated others as other, people as others, enslaved people as others, women as others, nature as other, as something else existing to serve us, those in power, those in the majority. And that means that our laws reflected that and legalized the treatment of other, in this case, nature. But also that means our culture is also supported that, meaning that we have long within our cultural spheres, our societies, thought of nature as other, as being existing to serve us. And We've seen that, the history of colonizing the United States has been very clear that nature is other. We see, for instance, in the 19th century, we had laws that would legally authorize the killing of species that were considered interfering with the ability of the United States to spread westward, species such as the wolves. And every wolf pelt that was brought to the authorities, you get paid for, because they wanted to decimate the wolf population and did an extremely good job of it. Truthfully, we're astonishingly good at destroying wildlife, at destroying ecosystems, at destroying nature on the whole. And our societies have been built up to protect and legitimize that kind of activity, with our laws encapsulating and protecting that harm of nature. And of course, the consequence of that is where we find ourselves today with overlapping environmental crises. So the work that we do has come at a time of these incredible crises, with people and governments and NGOs and even courts beginning to say enough is enough. Business as usual cannot continue. We cannot live in a sustainable way, in a protective way of the natural world, under legal systems which treat nature as something other, as commerce to serve human beings. And so there's begun this transition, what I think of as a really fundamental shift of how we govern ourselves toward the natural world. And that means changing not only our laws, but our hearts and minds as well, because culture reflects law and law reflects culture. And so we have this fundamental shift within society, as well as within our laws, that society builds up in order to begin to protect nature in a fundamentally different way, which means not only fundamentally shifting how we govern ourselves toward nature, but changing how nature itself is treated under the law. And this is embodied in this movement called the rights of nature, which means, just very simply, recognizing that the natural world, that is nature on the whole, ecosystems as well as species, possess legal rights. Legal rights are the highest form of legal protection that we have in human written law. And so in 2006, so 15 years ago, we had the very first rights of nature law written and enacted into law anywhere in the world. And that was in a small community in the state of Pennsylvania in the United States. And my co-founder of my organization, Thomas Lindsay, wrote that law. And that law, for the first time, transitioned and transformed nature from being treated as this thing to being without rights, to being a rights-bearing entity. So today, 15 years later, we now have communities across the United States, across multiple states, that have recognized legal rights of nature in local municipal laws. In Brazil, there are community laws that recognize rights of nature. National laws and constitutions have enacted and enshrined the rights of nature, including in Ecuador in 2008, Bolivia, Uganda. New Zealand has certain laws that recognize rights of particular ecosystems. Courts, as I mentioned in Colombia, its highest court, the Constitutional Court, recognized rights of the Atrato River, and now other ecosystems, including the Amazon within Colombia, have been recognized as having legal rights to protection and conservation. The courts in Bangladesh have recognized rights of all rivers within that country. These laws recognize rights such as the right of an ecosystem or nature to exist, just the most basic concept, the right to exist, the right to thrive, the right to regenerate, the right to evolve, the right to be restored if harmed. And these laws represent a fundamental shift in how nature is treated under the law. And when we think about species, we're beginning to see this beginning to more embody species wildlife. So for instance, in Ecuador, we worked on the 2008 Constitution, which created this new chapter for the first time anywhere in the world. A national constitution enshrined legal rights of nature, or Pachamama. And now, as cases are going through their court system to enforce those rights, this includes the rights of wildlife. So the court last year recognized that a frog species rights have been violated due to mining activities. And we're providing amicus briefs to cases before the Constitutional Court in Ecuador, in which we're arguing that the rights of nature, in particular, in Article 73 of the Constitution, which says that the state shall put in place restrictive or protective measures to prevent the extinction of species. That's necessary to guarantee the rights of nature. So activities that will interfere with fragile ecosystems and at-risk species, we believe violate the rights of nature, because those species are natural systems that have the highest form of legal protection, that is legal rights. And so we're seeing this growing movement when we recognize that in order to protect wildlife and protect at-risk, not just at-risk, but at-risk ecosystems, but the fragile ecosystems around the world that human activity are interfering with, in order to do that, we need to make a really fundamental shift in how we live on the planet. And that means doing more than, me recycling or composting or limiting my driving or other kinds of activities. All of those things are important for each of us to do to limit our footprint on the planet. But really what we're talking about is making a really fundamental systemic shift in how human beings live on the earth. It's no longer, people often criticize environmentalism for being a luxury to talk about protecting the environment, but we're well past that. It's not a luxury to have clean water. It's not a luxury to have clean air. Those should be fundamental rights that are protected and enforced. And if we think that we can survive without protecting the non-human animals on this planet, the species that we depend upon, unfortunately, that's going to prove to ourselves to be wildly detrimental and hurt our own survival. So whether we come at this from a moral or spiritual perspective or a very practical and selfish perspective, we need to make this fundamental shift. And that means driving into our highest levels of law, our constitutions, our national laws, even at the international level. That means we need to make this fundamental shift, and we have to do it together, which is why this building movement for the rights of nature, which is occurring at really all levels of government all around the world, I believe is a really necessary part of making that transition, that transformation about how we live on the planet and how we finally recognize ourselves as one of the species on this planet and not the superior species on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very informative presentation, Ms. Margil, and we are very grateful for your presence today. Thank you. We now move to our next panelist, Mr. Rukshan Jayewardene, all the way from Sri Lanka, our beautiful motherland. Hello, Rukshan. It's very nice to have you here with us today. So Mr. Jayewardene has an MPhil in South Asian archaeology from the University of Cambridge with 14 years of field experience in the Sri Lankan early historic period. For the past 25 years, he has been a wildlife photographer, writer on wildlife-related topics, and a popularizer of Sri Lanka's amazing biodiversity. He has intensively studied the Sri Lankan leopard in the wild, and through that exposure, has been inspired to work for its long-term conservation. He has been working with 5 nonprofit conservation environmental NGOs for over a 20-year period, and he continues to fight for the conservation of avoidable biodiversity loss in Sri Lanka. So Rukshan, this great forum is for you to start your presentation. Take it away.
Distinguished colleagues, Dr. Peter Sand and Ms. Mary Margil. Since both of you spoke on a more global topic, you, Dr. Sand, on the rates of extinction and loss and the loss of species diversity and ecosystem and how ecosystems have changed and what this world has lost. And you, Ms. Mary Margil, spoke about animal rights and how humans have changed the way they view animals, and how the movement to actually recognize animals to have the same legal rights that people do is gathering momentum, and that the kind of human-centric view of this world is also changing, and that these things will go towards more effective conservation and a better understanding and a better relationship between animals and people. I would like to just talk a little about, give an overview of what we all see in the news happening all the time, and how it then relates to my country, this island of Sri Lanka. Habitat loss and extinction is inextricably linked, and habitat loss, wherever it happens, whether it happens through climate change, whether it happens through deforestation, whether it happens through some other human agency, is the direct cause of loss of species, loss of diversity, and makes for an increasingly poorer world for us. To say nothing of all these animals that lose their lives, and these species that get pushed towards eventual extinction. And we see in many areas local extinctions. But if we talk about things on a global scale, we always hear about the front leading edge of extinction and difficulties that species like the polar bear or the Arctic fox faces, because this is where the first and largest impacts of climate change are seen, where ice caps are melting, and the habitat that once these animals utilized and lived and hunted on is changing forever. With each passing year, you see that the ice loss in the North Pole, and also the loss of ice and the breakup of icebergs and ice shelves in the South Pole are changing the lives of those animals forever. There is a belief in my country that climate change somehow doesn't affect us. I really don't know where this belief comes from, because climate change, from what we can see, is already affecting us. We have, just like so many parts of the world, enhanced weather events, whether it's monsoon storms and associated flooding events, or long-term droughts. And these things do cause local extinctions of species, especially some of the smaller or less known species, whether it be amphibians or reptiles. But also this affects mammals, that affects mammal movements. And we see a lot of changes that have actually accelerated over the last few years. Even in my own lifetime, I've seen many changes. And these things are linked to more global changes as well. If one is to talk about Sri Lanka as an island, Sri Lanka is the world's 24th largest island. And many people, especially in Sri Lanka, talk about a small island. We live on a small island. We do not live on a small island. We live on a very large island. And therefore, that is why Sri Lanka has the diversity we have, the large mammalian fauna that we have, and the viability of conserving many of the species that we've all come to know and love in this country. But the real challenge right now is that many species, many mammalian species especially, and then some avian species, as well as amphibians and reptiles, are mostly, are easiest to come across within protected areas. And we have a fairly well-established and quite old protected area network in this country. But Unfortunately, for some of these species, there are large numbers or high percentages of some species, notably elephants, that live outside of protected areas. And there is absolutely no provision for those species to survive for their long-term survival. Somehow we don't see how, as much as scientists have kept telling governments that elephants outside of protected areas have to be accommodated and not just to be seen as a problem of animals that create, human-elephant conflict, or that somehow elephants outside of protected areas is trouble for humans. We encroach forested areas each year that were traditional elephant habitats. We settle people in these traditional elephant pathways and corridors that connect more protected areas. And then when that connectivity goes, and when that food source that is often seasonally exploited is lost, elephants do keep coming out into the areas that are now farmland, recently converted into farmland, and the conflict starts growing. Certainly local conflicts pop up or start up like bushfires in areas that there were no conflicts. And across the island, human-elephant conflict has grown every passing year. And this is actually avoidable conflict. It is avoidable if there is proper land use planning. There is no proper land use planning because there are many arbitrary decisions taken by politicians at the local level. And then they are supported by politicians at a more national level and more important individuals in Sri Lanka's legislature. So it's unfortunate that these avoidable conflicts are pushing elephants more and more towards the brink. So elephants are not the only special problem that we have in conservation. Leopards are another animal that exploit areas outside of protected areas, and leopards are not taken into consideration once again in land use planning or in terms of developing different types of agriculture, animal husbandry, or cropping new crops in areas that didn't have them, and often loss of prey when the prey base gets diminished or depleted because of bushmeat hunting or crop protection, people killing wildlife in crop protection. Leopards start coming into homesteads and farmlands and taking dogs and goats, and the conflict that from a non-existent conflict, it grows into conflict. And then naturally leopards are persecuted, and then people want the leopards removed from that area. And what surprises me is often leopards who have lived for thousands of years, for millennia in that area, are seen to be in the area for the first time in the lives of the current generation of people in the area. And that is all credit to the leopard's ability to live secretively and not conflicting and not kind of getting in the way of humans and human livelihoods. But we are changing that pattern all over Sri Lanka. So once again, that's another species that we are pushing to local extinctions in areas outside of protected areas. So the protected area network is functioning less now as a network because we are cutting through all the interconnections. This is something that we as conservationists have constantly told governments. You have to look at this holistically. All land use planning must take into account where wildlife currently live. Otherwise, trying to conserve wildlife piecemeal or just in conservation areas and protected areas is not going to really work, because we don't understand what the minimum habitat requirements for some species are in a given area. We don't understand what the minimum population, viable population size is. And if we reduce certain local populations through our own actions to below a viable minimum, just time is all that will take for a local extinction to happen in a subpopulation. Then there's also the genetic isolation of species that is occurring, where if you look at the leopard once again as a pan-island species that occupies many different types of habitats and successfully lives in the highest mountains and right down to the coast in hot, dry environments as well as cool, wet. It's not an animal that has a particular preference for any type of climate that this island offers. But we don't seem to recognize that all we need to do is give them a certain amount of space wherever they live and stay out of their way, which is quite easy to do. And they will look after the rest. So sometimes the conservation formula for the entire species is a fairly simple one, but the political will and the administrative will to implement these things is all important. Okay. Once again, I think habitat destruction also affects the microclimate. Forests that deforestation in Sri Lanka locally affects local rainfall. Local rainfall changes the type of animals, that the preferences for the levels of rainfall change from species to species. So we see today certain species spreading into areas that they were not found previously, and other species actually receding from areas that they were found traditionally. It can be partly explained through microclimate change and vegetational changes as much as anything else that we can discern. So, for instance, peacocks are spreading right through the country. They're coming out of the dry zone into the wet zone. And it's a successful colonization of the wet zone as far as the peacock is concerned, but they have an impact on other species that we don't fully understand. They feed, they're quite omnivorous. They feed on reptiles as much as grains and other vegetable matter. And some of the reptiles that they may be feeding on may be point endemic species that live only in the wet zone, live only in a few square kilometers of land area. And all those species are now under threat simply because of a bird like the peacock is spreading in numbers into areas that it didn't occupy before. So, but many of these changes, we have facilitated the conditions for peacocks to spread. But until we study what those things are, mitigatory measures or culling or other methodologies may not be successful at all. Okay, well, since species loss is directly related to habitat loss, there are more than a dozen medium to large scale sites of deforestation in the island right now. I mean, things that are ongoing. We do not understand why the government doesn't realize that a country that has only 65,000 square kilometers of land, but percentage-wise, we have probably less than 20% of forest cover, and the forest cover is reducing at an accelerating rate. And this is not an equation that is going to balance. But most of the forest cover lost in Sri Lanka right now is in the dry zone. The wet zone has only probably 2.5% of the forest cover of Sri Lanka is, only 2.5% of the natural forest cover of Sri Lanka is found in the wet zone. And the rest, maybe about 17% in the dry zone. And the total is certainly not exceeding 20%. and it's reducing all the time. The Forest Department puts out a figure of 27%, and how they do that is that they factor in eucalyptus, pinus plantations in mountain areas, as well as eucalyptus in the dry zone. So those are basically forest plantations or plantation forests. They also add the rubber lands of Sri Lanka, which is basically a tree crop. So these falsified figures are given over to legislators who are part of the teams that plan land use or reforestation or land utilization or conversion of forest lands to agricultural lands. So this is a pretty bad situation, because if you're going to work with inaccurate statistics and think that 27% forest cover, the target should be 33% or 30% by the year 2025 or 2030. What are you actually doing? Even if you grow or increase that percentage by 5 percentage points, you're still going to be under 25%, possibly 22%. So statistics are unimportant if the way the forest cover is calculated or assessed or classified is faulty. And so we have always called upon the Forest Department to produce correct figures based on satellite maps and the mapping capability they have. More than anybody else, they know the exact forest cover of this island. We can only try to figure out what it is, because sometimes they do not reveal what they're adding. They're adding green cover, they're adding tree crops, and they're coming up with certain figures. And if those are given to policymakers, then they can only work on the total figure. But if you really break it down and look at the nuts and bolts of how they came up with that, then we have a serious problem. So many conservationists believe we are pushing this country towards a minimum forest cover that is important for healthy agriculture, healthy life, water resources, all the things that humans and animals need for life in a given area. So we have actually started using the word ecocide, because we do realize that we are approaching ecocide if we don't change the track we are on. So to touch on what Mari said on animal rights, long ago, in the 3rd century BC, with the conversion of this island to Buddhism, with the conversion of the king of Sri Lanka, who was then possibly a Hindu or some kind of Brahminical adherent, but he was out hunting, and it's a famous story that everybody in Sri Lanka knows, and the attained Buddhist monk Arhat Mahinda appeared in front of him and called him by his first name and told him to stop. And then he preached to him about the importance of life, all life, and told him very importantly that apart from stopping hunting, that he has to realize that he is only the custodian of everything, the land and the beasts of the land. He said the beasts of the earth and the birds of the air all have equal rights as you, O king, to live on this land and enjoy its benefits. And you, O king, are only their custodian, only the custodian of this land. So that message, somehow this Buddhist ethic of non-harming has come through from those early historic times right through to the present. But in the present, we see that somehow this Buddhist ethic, which has made this island quite different to other islands that have lost so much of what they had, because perhaps they didn't have a underpinning philosophic, if I were to put it, a kind of great inhibition to take the lives of living beings and kind of realize that they do have rights, but that somehow doesn't seem to be translating into this 21st century. And what I always say is elephants, leopards, bears, all these species have equal, if not more, rights to this island than we do, because all of these species, we can say without any kind of hesitation, preceded humans, preceded early man into this island. So they were here first. So if people want to talk about who has rights on the basis of who was here first, we certainly weren't. Elephants and leopards and bears and absolutely all the birds and reptiles. Some of the reptiles are very ancient. They're linked to Gondwana land. So they were here first. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rukshan Jayewardene, for that deep insight into the challenges that we are faced with in Sri Lanka's wildlife. So we truly appreciate your presentation today. Now, with regard to all the presentations that were made today, I would like to invite Mr. Sanjeev Varnasurya, one of our own community leading wildlife and nature photographers in Los Angeles, in our Sri Lankan community in Southern California. I know Sanjeev has been listening to our presentations today and being a very enthusiastic photographer and a lover of the nature. I'm sure he has some questions for all three of you. Sanjeev, go ahead.
I do. Thank you, Medini, and thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. It was very informative. I do have some brief questions to each one of you, and I'm hoping that you can shed some light. I'll start with Dr. Sand. Dr. Sand, I've always heard this argument between the importance of eco tourism and also trophy hunting, specifically in West Africa. Now, personally, I am not, a fan of trophy hunting at all, especially, the lions and elephants in Africa and throughout the world. But there's this argument saying that trophy hunting and that particular segment of tourism generates quite a bit of revenue that is used for conservation and other efforts, anti-poaching efforts and whatnot in certain parts of the world. Could you be so kind enough to shed some light on the truths, both sides of the argument, and also whether governments are actually allowing this or controlling this? If you can shed some light on that.
All right, thank you. That's an old conflict that continues today, even under the conventions that exist, and it comes up regularly during meetings of the CITES conference, of other conferences. The question of hunting as a potential supporter for wildlife protection is not debatable, really. It's possible that the effects of hunting can help to preserve species that are in fact becoming a threat to local communities, to agricultural communities. On the other hand, the continuing conflict between hunters and environmentalists is something that needs to be addressed by the kind of restrictions that can be put, particularly on the hunting of species that are in fact overexploited and overused. So the conventions that exist try to protect species at the same time as they try to make sure that the long-term support for endangered species is not really reduced. We will have to live with this conflict, probably even in future discussions at the international conference is concerned. But it is important that we recognize that there are limits to what we can do to nature, and we must make sure that these limits ensure the survival of species that are threatened.
Do you think governments, now in the US, this is not much of a problem because, you know, hunting is kind of controlled because permits are issued and hunting happens in specific time periods or seasons throughout the US. Do you think foreign governments are doing enough, or in your opinion, what other things can be done? And also, does social media have any kind of part in it to promote, you know, either segment or move people away from trophy hunting?
Well, as I said, we have this problem not just in the United States, although there's controlled hunting in the US, but we have it on an international level. You have the kind of hunting expeditions that go on by wealthy tourists that not necessarily contribute to the well-being of animal life in the countries where they actually carry out the hunting. On the other hand, it's clear that many of these countries do welcome the financial resources that can come into the country, and there is an issue over how much, for example, in the field of ivory hunting, that is hunting for trophies of elephants are tolerable under these circumstances. And as I mentioned, the CITES Convention has finally decided against allowing controlled ivory trade, simply because it led to an overexploitation that had gone out of control. And there are limits to what one can do in this field, and these limits will need to be defined at international meetings, because it's not a national problem alone. It's an international issue, particularly the illegal trade that follows from uncontrolled hunting, from hunting against the actual laws that are in force in the habitats concerned.
Thank you very much. My next question is for Ms. Margil. So in the US, back in 1995, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone after they went extinct in the 1920s. And reading through some of the reports and watching documentaries, we are experiencing the return of lost ecosystems and a balance where the vegetation is coming back because the population of deer and elk is being controlled by the wolves, and the building of beaver ponds in reservoirs are coming back to normal and things are stabilizing. But when you move outside Yellowstone, you see the farmers and the ranchers are completely against it, and they essentially want to hunt and kill every single wolf that they see outside the borders of the park, because they're attacking, you know, their cows and you know, the animals that they use. Now, how far have we come in the recovery of those lost ecosystems, and are there continuing challenges, you know, inside and outside the state? Can you shed some light on that?
Thank you. Yes, I think Yellowstone is actually a really interesting example. Yellowstone is a national park in the United States, and it's home to extraordinary landscapes. And as you said, like the reintroduction of wolves, you have bison there, you have sandhill cranes that go through there, you have bears, you have an enormous array of species in what is really an extraordinary ecosystem. The difficulty, of course, becomes the moment an animal leaves the boundaries of that national park, so that national protected area. Essentially, they get a tourist t-shirt with a bullseye on their back because they can be shot and killed. And so it's a really incredible, important example of what can happen when we bring a ecosystem back into balance by reintroducing the species that were already there that we killed off or exterminated. And what happens, you know, not that you quite leave it alone. Yellowstone is certainly a managed ecosystem, but it is enough of an example for us to understand that it can recover. But of course, the difficulty then becomes we isolate those examples. And even if we protect them very, very well, those landscapes and the species within them, it isolates them, and we think we've done our job in some ways. And so everything outside of it, even the surrounding ecosystems, become quite literally fair game. And that's the same for the bison that do very, very well. And yet we don't hear the stories about the moment, you know, a buffalo should cross out of Yellowstone National Park, suddenly they can be, you know, there can be hunted. Same with wolves. You know, I was reading recently, just a few days ago in the United States, we have the delisting, you know, no longer being listed under the Endangered Species Act of certain species, and wolves included, that now you have hunting, you know, just recreational hunting, trophy hunting, as you were talking about. And it, of the species that we've worked so hard to try to come back and to have a robust, resilient wild population, and yet now we just hunt them not for meat, but for recreation, for trophy. And it's, I think, a really important reflection of who we still are as a culture, and that we, that we still think of wildlife as something else, as something existing for our enjoyment. Great, we brought them back. Now we get to shoot them again. I mean, it's a very strange cognitive dissonance that we have going on. My hope is that we're beginning to make a shift so that we understand that it's time for us. We've gone well past truly Earth's limitations, but it's time that maybe we can begin to make that shift. And hopefully examples like Yellowstone will help sort of flood our hearts and our minds with hope, and we can reflect that into our laws. But we're still a long ways from that. But I think we're beginning to see that with people, you know, governments, courts, NGOs saying, you know, this isn't just about bringing back a wild species to a national protected area, whether it's in the United States or somewhere else. That's not enough. That's a good start, but it's not enough. And we really make this transformation about how we live with these other species, because our own lives depend upon it. And hopefully these examples like Yellowstone can help us think broader than just that place.
I think, thank you. I think, you know, something that's totally lacking is, and me moving to the US when I was in high school, we learned about, you know, the killing of the bisons, you know, the moving of Indians to reservations and those lands. But there's no education about, you know, the extinction of the wolves from certain areas and the effects of reintroduction. Now it's been 26 years since they were introduced. Do you think we are doing enough in educating younger generations in terms of conservation and also, the positive effects of, reintroduction and protecting species and the positives from it? If not, is there a way, do you think, a path forward that we can look at or should be looked at?
Well, I'm actually quite thrilled to hear that you learned that in your schooling, because I grew up in the United States and I did not learn much about that. I think that we can do a great deal more. One of the texts that was most important to me was the book Of Wolves and Men by Barry Lopez, who passed away very recently. He was an incredible naturalist and writer. And he talked about the very systematic, intentional destruction of the wolf populations in the lower 48 states.
It's manifest destiny, right?
I'm sorry?
It's manifest destiny. It's
Absolutely.
It's conquer nature. That's what it's there for, right?
Yes. And so part of what we try to do when we do education and training and workshops is draw the parallels that you just draw about moving native peoples off their lands, moving buffalo off their lands, moving wolves off their lands. Essentially, there's so many parallels in how we did that within the law. And the United States is an unfortunately horribly bad example of what happened. But it also happened in other parts of the world, of course, through colonization. But this idea of essentially wiping out everything that was there, people and the natural world, in order for this dominant white culture to come in and settle the land as if nothing else was there. And the law and culture and all, the arts, everything were used to try to legitimize that activity, to make us think it was okay. And as you say, manifest destiny. Of course, this is what should happen. Of course, this is what this land is worth for us. And so wiping everything off of that land, that's not something that we learn about in school. You may have heard about, I may have heard briefly about moving native peoples off their lands. But you didn't hear about that on a wide scale by any means. It wasn't understood as a systemic effort that pervaded the history of this nation, the United States, but also you don't hear about the wildlife that also got moved off. So thank you for drawing that parallel, because it's not something that we talked about in school at all, something you learn later, hopefully. But I think if we begin to understand that it's systemic, that it happens everywhere, that the history of colonization around the world is about this, and that it's time to reverse that and to understand that certain people aren't superior to other people, that certain species aren't superior to other species. It's this really fundamental shift in our minds that I think is absolutely essential. And I'm hoping that we're beginning to see some of that transformation begin.
Because it's kind of challenging, because you look at the periphery of the country and the mindset is totally different than what's happening in the central part of the US. You have a lot of progressive thinking, forward thinking minds versus our civil rights and our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and whatnot. And it's not just economical, but it's also political, in the sense, you have two different mindsets within the US and its borders. And it's like we're speaking two different languages. And, do you see that changing in the future?
I think that dichotomy, that there's two different mindsets in the United States right now, I think there is some of that, of course, but I also think some of that has been, dramatized for purposes of, like mainstream news and politicians. I think when you get onto the ground and you start talking with people about what's important to them, like, is clean water important to you? Yes. Is clean air important to you? Yes. That may not translate to, that means I want to protect the manatees in Florida, or I want to protect the wolves. But it is an understanding that what happens in nature impacts me and others. So here's an example where I think that that big dichotomy, right versus left in the United States, breaks down a bit, which is when you're in a community, when you're talking with people who are seeing things happening in their own community that are harming nature, harming rivers, harming waterways. We do quite a bit of work in the state of Florida, which is a very politically divided state. And on election day in November 2020, when we had the presidential election, there was also a vote in Orange County, Florida, which is, people may know, it's where Walt Disney World is. And there was a vote by the people of that county on an initiative to recognize the rights of rivers and other waterways within Orange County. And it passed with 89% of the vote. So this was a presidential election. You had people who were voting for the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. You had people voting for the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, in a very divided state. But 89% of those people, whoever they voted at the top of the ballot, were voting to protect the rights to clean water and the rights of rivers within that community. That's really an extraordinary thing. That means that partisan politics kind of faded away. And the reason I believe that that happened is because people, no matter what their political place on this political divide is, see that within the state of Florida, rivers, oceans, the red tides, the algae blooms, their waterways are being significantly harmed. And it's very clear that human activity is causing that. That's a problem from an economic tourism standpoint. It's a problem just to have clean water. It's a problem for drinking water. And so that has a tendency to cut across the political spectrum when people see a common problem that's coming right at home. That gives me a great deal of hope that people can be joined together to protect these places that they understand are really critical to their own survival, let alone the survival of nature and wildlife. But that to me is the kind of thing that we kind of gets ignored, I think, when we look at like national media, what's happening on the ground for people who are living in a place together and seeing it being harmed.
Great. Thank you so much. My final question or questions are from Mr. Jayewardene. So, growing up in Sri Lanka, spending my early years, conservation and the disappearance of ecosystems was not considered a huge issue because, people are a lot more conscious and a lot more emotional when it came to protecting species and the land that we live. Even not picking up after yourself on a street was looked down upon. So, many parts of the world, ecotourism and wildlife safaris and whatnot, especially in West Africa, is seen as a very important and integral part of tourism. So in Sri Lanka, this has been developing and growing. My question is, are people understanding or beginning to understand the importance and also the economic positive impacts of ecotourism in Sri Lanka? And is there anything that's been done to develop that sector and protect wildlife and see, okay, this is something that we can also show. Sri Lanka is not just about beautiful beaches and good food and history.
Oh yes, they perfectly understand the economic importance of ecotourism. The government does, the state sector, that the tourist board, the tourism development. I think it's now a key. Rather than the tourist board, it's a tourism development corporation, whatever. So there's slight difference in the nomenclature, but basically the tourist board and the hotels that are involved in the kind of the private sector involved in ecotourism or nature-based tourism. They certainly understand economic importance. That is why the sector has grown, I think, substantially in the last 25 years. But still, we don't see the commitment to conservation necessary to make this sustainable. And that is very unfortunate. Whether it is a commitment to conserving the elephant or the leopard or any other species, birds, we would like to see more engagement from the private sector, more involvement in terms of putting pressure on the government if the government is not doing the right thing, working together, collaborating with government agencies to improve all aspects of the product. If we are just going to talk about it in terms of economics, the wildlife tourism sector or wildlife is a tourist product, but it is unlike any other tourist product. It is these are natural systems. There is only so much you can do and fool around with them before the adverse impacts are felt through those systems and you have lost. So to make them sustainable, you need to work and understand what biologists and ecologists are doing and utilize the research coming from them and listen to their voices and listen to their cautions and incorporate these things into developing the ecotourism impact to be something that is kind of has a light footprint and has long-term sustainability. But that kind of tourism that is developing or kind of almost morphing into the so-called ecotourism often is quite damaging. It deals with large numbers who are sent into national parks and other wildlife areas for short durations in a kind of unsustainable manner, and not also the interest level, the education level of the tourist is not really considered. So often you get tourists who'd rather be someplace else, being shoved on a weekend into a national park together with all the local tourists or who we call weekend warriors who have gone from Colombo or other cities into the park to do their wildlife photography or wildlife viewing or get their basically wilderness fix. And there is overcrowding, there is a lot of competition and jostling and noise and indiscipline, and that impacts wildlife, because wild animals, we are basically invading their territory, their home areas, and putting a kind of pressure that obviously affects them. It can affect breeding, it can affect some of the shy animals from going about their daily routines and business, and they're only thinking of the rupees and cents, and that's very unfortunate. And that hasn't changed over time now. It's been 20 years, or maybe 25 years of this kind of tourism. And certainly 11 years or so after the end of the war, where wildlife tourism and all tourism started growing pretty exponentially, I'd say. And there have been a couple of hiccups because we've had our own internal problems, and then of course COVID-19 comes in. But now in this COVID-19 year, or the second year of COVID-19, we have a great opportunity to kind of hit the reset button and start over again, and to develop a very different kind of ecotourism, a genuine, sustainable ecotourism product that both the private sector and the government sector needs to sit down together and work out what the priorities are and how we should go forwards. And the information and the data and the research and the knowledge is all there. It's just a matter of marrying the two. Thank you.
One final question for you. Is conservation part of the education and curriculum in Sri Lanka? Is it happening now? Do you see it happening?
Unfortunately, no. No, it has never been. Conservation is certainly not part of the national curriculum. Neither is biodiversity and what Sri Lanka has in terms of the richness of her wilderness areas, wildlife, biodiversity, what makes it a unique island. It is a unique island. It's a large island, but it's not enormous. The list of islands, as I said, we are the 24th largest, but starts with Greenland, which is I don't know, 40 times the size of Sri Lanka, maybe more. And many of the other islands that are in the list before us are much larger, not 2 or 3 times larger, 5, 6, 7, 8 times larger. And then, of course, there are many thousands, hundreds of thousands smaller than us. And some of those islands are not really viable in terms of human beings and animals living harmoniously together. But ours is. And we have brought this story from, you know, pre-Christian times all the way to the 21st century. And there's no reason to lose this now, just because we have almost 22 million people, a human population approaching 22. We still have elephants in their thousands, leopards in probably more than 1,000, bears unknown numbers. These are just the megafauna, but the small animals, you know, large viable populations. And many other endemic species, many bird species, many migrants. We still have habitats that suit migrant birds who don't stop any longer in southern India, but keep coming to Sri Lanka, because we have, our landscape and ecosystems have changed at a slower rate than parts of India. But there's nothing to be proud of what's happening here right now. But we can put the brakes on a lot of these things. But unfortunately, it starts, like you say, with education. And if we don't teach our children what is important about this island, and what is different, and what is valuable, and what is irrecoverable, and in terms of putting conservation, biodiversity, knowledge about nature into the curricula in a relevant sense, not just teach biology in a kind of a disassociated way, and not linking it to the biodiversity on the ground in this island, I think it's an uphill battle. Conservationists are fighting a really uphill battle. There are young people coming up to, you know, take over this fight and to make sure that biodiversity in Sri Lanka is something sustainable into the future, long after people like I are dead and gone. But they are learning about it by other means, not through the school curricula. And that is really sad.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanji, for leading our Q&A session today. We truly appreciate your participation in our panel today. Thank you. So we have had 3 excellent presentations to commemorate the World Wildlife Day, and we thank our speakers and the audience for joining. This webinar will be presented again on March 3rd at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. With that, we conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everyone.